This is it. This is my time to shine. The reason I was born. I finally get a chance to talk about one of the greatest properties ever to grace this earth. I'm of course talking about Bionicle. As a kid, Bionicle was everything to me, a Lego toy line following a group of hero robots known as Toa, as they battle the forces of evil that threaten the life of the island, Nui. While most toy companies in the 80s and 90s would just release a shitty cartoon to get you to buy their products, Lego got more creative with it, relying on a multimedia story that spanned across books, video games, flash games, movies, online serials, and more. No one piece of Bionicle media contained all the answers. Lego made us work for our story. With time, the complex lore of Bionicle would only continue to complicate. To fully understand the story, you had to have been a fan pretty early on. In hindsight, this may not have been such a great idea, as it made it hard for newcomers to get invested, but as someone who remained a fan till the end, I have a strong appreciation for what LEGO managed to accomplish. The form of Bionicle media that both had the greatest impact on me and helped lead me through the complex story were the comics included in free LEGO magazines. Written by Greg Farshtey, a prominent figure in the Bionicle community, these comics acted as an abridged version of the story so that kids could follow the main events of Bionicle better. They never went into very much detail, as it was every other piece of media's job to fill in those blanks. The books were published by DC Comics, who greatly encouraged the idea in hopes that it would lead to more kids wanting to read comic books, and yeah, it worked. I got into the comics as a kid around the time the Toa Nuva were introduced. I remember a free issue being handed out at a Toys R Us and asking my mom if I could sign up for LEGO magazine, and boy am I glad she said yes. I could easily remember bits and pieces of the story, but I decided it was time to go back and reread the entire comic series from beginning to end. And little to my surprise, yeah, this series had a lot more going on than a small child like me could ever fully comprehend. So in honor of my reread of these comics that mean the world to me, I've decided to take a closer look at each individual arc and go into detail on what works, what doesn't, and just what it was that made me fall in love with these comics in the first place. Also, apologies if I butcher any names, just know that if I do, you have every right to hate me, and I deserve to die. So let's begin. The Bionicle series was split into, I'd say, 5 main arcs, with the first being the Nui Saga. The story begins when 6 mysterious canisters wash up on shore of the island of Nui, which are each revealed to carry a Toa, mighty heroes of the Bionicle world. The 6 heroes search for the Great Kanoe mask that will grant each of them special powers that they will use to battle foes like the Borak, insect-like mechanical beings that used organic masks called Krana to control the minds of those who oppose them. One thing that's very important to note about the first arc was that it was very much style over substance. While it was heavily implied that the island was ancient and contained many secrets, the focus was more on the action than anything else, and it really was not subtle when it came to selling toys, though some of the ideas that they came up with back then were pretty ingenious. This also means that the Toa, or more specifically the Toa Mata, aren't really given any sort of character, at least in the comics. Much of their dialogue is delivered in a very matter-of-fact way. I will, however, say that the illustrations by Carlos Deanda are brilliant, with Randy Elliott taking over a bit later. The decision to illustrate Bionicle characters accurately to how their toys looked must have been no easy task, and something I have immense respect for. I also love that Deanda's art includes drawing the characters with scuffs and scratches on their armor. It gives the illustrations more depth and really makes you believe that these are ancient beings that have existed for a very long time. Eventually, the Toa Mata would be transformed into a new form of heroes known as the Toa Nuva, during a battle with Kadok and Gadok, beast-like creatures who controlled the Borak. This transformation was clearly just another way to sell toys, but would pave the way for bigger threats, as the Toa faced new enemies like the Borak Call and the dreaded Rakshi, serpent-like beings controlled by the dreaded Makuta Pterodax, also known as the main reoccurring villain of the Bionicle franchise. Eventually, the story evolves into a search for a mysterious 7th Toa. This is where the comics start getting a bit confusing chronologically, as Takanuva, the 7th Toa, and Toa of Light just kind of comes out of nowhere in issue 14. But that doesn't matter because we finally get to see Takanuva take down Makuta, right? You've gotta be fucking kidding me. So yeah, as I mentioned before, LEGO made Bionicle fans work for their story, and if you were ever expecting to get some sort of satisfying conclusion, the only way to get it was to purchase the Bionicle Mask of Light movie on DVD. Mask of Light actually does do a pretty good job at filling in some plot holes towards the end of the Mata Nui arc. However, and I know this is highly controversial, but I'm gonna be honest, the Bionicle movies kind of sucked. Even as a kid, I wasn't really a fan of these movies, and I think it's because I always preferred the more serious tone of the comics, even if they were just kids' comics. In the movie's defense, adapting Bionicle and its complicated events into a children's film must have been no easy task, and while I'm not a fan of the movie's humor or the very outdated animation, they did the best they probably could given the circumstances. The Toa Nuva half of the Mata Nui Saga shares pretty much my same thoughts as the first half. It's very much style over substance, but if that style isn't killer. Another aspect of the comics I failed to mention were the many ads placed within. Not just for the toys, but for games, Bionicle Nikes, Bionicle toothbrushes, all things I would immediately sell my soul for. Or how about this exciting product of its time? Andy McDonald rides for Bionicle. Remember Andy McDonald? Neither do I. But perhaps the greatest promotional piece ever to grace this pitiful earth? Could it be? Yes! Yes! It is! Bionicle, the album, featuring music from Cold, Sev, Woven, and the Rob Zombie. It was never released. After the events of the Mata Nui Saga, Bionicle would take a step back into the past with the Nui Saga. Stay with me now. In this story, we discover that the 6 Turaga, who are pretty much elders of the Bionicle world, were once Toa themselves on the island of Nui, not to be confused with Mata Nui. They go on a quest to find 6 Matoran, villagers of the Bionicle universe, who will lead them to great discs that they can use to defeat the Morbuska, a giant plant that wreaks havoc among the city. The Nui Saga is this time completely illustrated by Randy Elliott with Pete Pantazis as the colorist, and while I am a bigger fan of Carlos D'Anda's illustrations, I will admit that the story itself is a massive improvement over the previous arc. Probably the most notable change is that the Toa are now characters, each with their own unique personalities. The comics may not have a lot of time to look at their characters in depth, but something is surely better than nothing. The Mata Nui Saga also feels like it has a main character for fans to connect to. Vakama is the leader of the Toa Metru, and you can sense the weight of responsibility he feels, especially in later issues. He really reminds me of Leonardo in either the 2003 or 2012 animated series, and I'm all for it. The island of Nui is also a cool concept. The fact that these characters started out on a highly advanced island made up of cities, factories, and various modes of transportation, only for them to have to flee to a new island after its collapse was such a cool idea. It honestly has similar vibes to the Star Wars prequels, with the way things so quickly devolved after a terrible event, and I don't think I'm overstepping my bounds when I say that Bionicle did it better. There are some questionable aspects of Nui's lore that may be better explained in other media. I found myself wondering why some of the creatures on Nui were completely organic, while in other arcs all Rahi were mechanical. But as I said, maybe it's all better explained elsewhere and I'm just being oblivious. As the story progresses, things begin to heat up as Turaga Doom declares the Toa Metru imposters and bans them for the kidnapping of the missing Toa who came before them, Toa Likan. This is where the story really gets interesting as we get to see the heroes betrayed by the very people they swore to protect. The idea of having a Turaga act as a villain was another way of breaking the mold, until it was revealed that Turaga Doom was just Makuta Pterodax in disguise, something I wasn't a big fan of. But the only way you would know that is if you watched Bionicle 2, Legends of Nui. Yeah, just like the previous arc, the only way to know how it all ends was to go out and buy the movie, and it wouldn't be the last time they did this. Quickly after the events of the second Bionicle movie, the comics continued with the Nui prequel arc, this time going in an edgier direction than Bionicle had ever done before. This would become a staple for how many of their stories would be done in the near future. Metro Nui is invaded by Visorak spiders, being led by new villains Sidorak and Rudaka. The Visorak captured the Toa Metru in their cocoons, transforming them into Toa Hortica, half Toa, half beasts. With the help of some Rahaga, Toa who had also been transformed into beasts, they seek the help of Kitangu to turn themselves back before they become permanent beasts while saving Metro Nui from Sidorak and Rudaka's rule. If we're going to get into how the characters look, I think it's safe to say a lot of people weren't really fans of their designs, seeing as the Hortica were mostly just clones of one another. But putting that aside, there's a lot in terms of storytelling here that's well executed. I won't argue that the whole concept around this half of the Metro Nui Saga can feel a bit edgy at times, but one thing I really liked was the decision to get away from Makuta and focus on new villains. Rudaka is a real highlight of this arc, as she only pretends to be loyal to Sidorak, only to stab him in the back later on. Of course, you would have to watch Bionicle 3 Web of Shadows to know that, available only on DVD October 2005. I also like that we're given the chance to see more Toa that existed on the island even before the Toa Metru. Issue 25, which follows the Toga Haga on a mission to retrieve the Mask of Light, is one of my favorite issues in the series just for the way it builds upon the mythology. Eventually, the Toa Hortica would be transformed back into their former selves, followed by the decision to become Turaga. The island of Metro Nui would be destroyed during the events of the Great Cataclysm, which would lead to the Matoran of the island being relocated to Mata Nui. If you are unfamiliar with the events of the Great Cataclysm, it's only one of the most important events ever to happen in Bionicle lore. To briefly summarize, the Great Cataclysm was the effect of Makuta Pterodax making Mata Nui fall asleep. It was the first step of the plan of Pterodax. All of the damage done by it has been reversed by the staff of Artaka. Long before the event actually occurred, there was a Matoran legend known as the Legend of Eternal Shadow, when the light of the Great Spirit
Land
will
was
be
later
lost
called
forever.
Void
The
Nui,
sign of
with
the
legend
legend coming
coming
true
true
would be the
land
twin
unknown
suns
because
of
the
Eternal
mask of
overlapping,
light
darkening
igniting
large
large
double
volcano.
eclipse. Pterodax, leader of the
Volcano
Volcano,
damage
system,
caused
causes
system
dedicated
dedicated
to
to
Mata Nui,
Nui,
and
whole
Matoran,
Matoran,
sealing
sealing
that with land to the
energy.
energy.
Another
Another
version made before the
Cataclysm was set in.
To do this, the plan to fight possibilities with the
Overall, the Metro Nui Saga is one where I actually prefer the first half to the second, but even the second half had a lot going for it. Its edgier tone would lead to my all-time favorite Bionicle arc, and one that turned me from an average fan into a Bionicle superfan. I'm of course referring to Bionicle Ignition. So to clear up some things first, a lot of fans consider Ignition to be a trilogy made up of stories that took place on Voya Nui, Mari Nui, and finally Karta Nui, but I disagree with that. Mainly because the comics that took place on Karta Nui were published under the title Battle for Power instead, and followed a different set of Toa. No, to me, Ignition is an arc made up of two parts. The first part takes place on the new island of Voya Nui. Much like Mata Nui, the island is visited by 6 mysterious canisters, only instead of Toa, it carries Paraka, selfish and malicious beings in the Bionicle universe, also known as Skakti if you want to get specific. They pose as Toa and immediately send the Matoran of the island to work, finding the Kanoi Ignika, the Mask of Life. The Toa Nuva head to Voya Nui to free the enslaved Matoran and retrieve the Mask of Life before the Paraka can, but just end up getting their asses handed to them. Fortunately, 6 Matoran from McDonald Land decide to travel to the island as well. What they expected to accomplish, I have no idea, but their canisters are conveniently struck by a bolt of lightning that transforms the 6 of them into the new Toa Ignika. 'Cause destiny or something? It is there the Toa Ignika challenge the Paraka to battle, as it's a race to see who can reach the Mask of Life first. The most notable aspect of Ignition, and a big part of why I love it so much, is the beautiful art style. In an attempt to go even edgier, Bionicle traded out its previous artist for Stuart Sager, whose art is both unique and beautiful. It's without a doubt my favorite artwork featured in one of the Bionicle sagas. Unlike the previous arcs, Ignition is much less about the Toa and puts most of its focus on the villains. I found this to be a clever decision, as further developing the villains would probably lead to better toy sales. This is also around the time that I started getting into buying the toys myself. I remember Vazok and the Green Visorak being my first Bionicles, and I still have them along with most of my other Bionicles to this day. The Paraka were not the only intimidating villains on the island, as we also had Brutaka, who has to have one of the best designs throughout the franchise. His rivalry with Axon is one of the most interesting parts of the Ignition arc, and it's a shame that the comics don't go further into it. Oh, and the best villain to come out of Ignition, and maybe even the entirety of Bionicle, was Vezon and his pet Rahi, Fenrak. Vezon is actually another half of Vezok, who was split in two by the Spear of Fusion. He also traveled to the island to find the Mask of Life, but was transformed into a Guardian of the Mask when he got there. He's pretty much just the better version of all the other Paraka. There's a lot I love about the first half of Ignition. The stakes feel higher, the edgy tone works better than it did with the Toa Hordica, mostly thanks to the focus on villains and the cool new art. I also love the Mask of Life, which, while it may be a MacGuffin of sorts, is a really cool concept that would become an essential part of Bionicle lore in future stories. If I had any complaint about Ignition's first half, it's that the Toa and Nika really don't get much focus, at least in the comics. But considering just how much I love the villains here, I'm willing to let that slip by.
Yo, yo, Paraka! Yo, yo, Paraka!
The second half of Ignition uses the subtitle Sea of Darkness. Much like the first half, it starts off with a few issues that pretty much just focus on the villains. This time being the Baraki, 6 powerful leaders who were banished to an underwater pit where they were transformed into mutated sea creatures. The 6 of them escape the pit and go on a search for the Mask of Life, which has flung itself from the island of Voya Nui into the sea near the underwater city of Mari Nui. The Baraki are all very similar to the Paraka, which might be a negative to some, but I really like these guys. Their designs are all very unique, and I think that's their main appeal. Eventually, the Toa and Nika travel underwater to find the mask themselves when a flash of light from the Mask of Life transforms them into the Toa Mari, who can now breathe underwater. And why the Toa and Nika thought they could go underwater without any means of oxygen to begin with is beyond me. The Toa Mari probably have my favorite designs of any Bionicle sets. They were a perfect marriage between the new and the old and made any necessary changes to complaints fans might have had about the Toa and Nika. A familiar foe would also make a comeback as Makuta Pterodax is found to be hiding in the body of Maxylos, a guard of the pit. However, the story had bigger things planned for him as he would make a more prominent return in the next arc. I like the Mari Nui half quite a bit. My only real complaint is that we never really get a good look at Mari Nui itself. Much of it takes place on the outside, so we can only see silhouettes of buildings in the back. It's a place I'd have liked to see been more explored in the comics. I could also complain a bit about the Toa not getting enough focus again, but I would be lying if I didn't mention that Mitoro has probably the most satisfying arc of any Bionicle character. I think it's safe to call him a fan favorite among many. Seeing as the Bionicle comics are abridged versions of the main story, there's usually little time to feel any strong emotions, but boy does Mitoro's story get to me. After the events of Mari Nui, Ignition would come to an end, and thus Bionicle would begin its shortest arc, Battle for Power. Battle for Power took place on Carta Nui, which is kind of like a big cave with swamplands as the base. The series featured the return of the Toa Nuva, and was actually split into 2 separate lines, made up of 3 heroes and 3 villains each. The first line was Fantoka, which, yeah, I can't say I'm a big fan of. I like Lua's design quite a bit, but Pohatu and Kapaka have seen better days. I'm fine with the villains' designs, though. And then there was the following line, Mystica, which...
Ugh, it's hideous!
Definitely not a fan of these redesigns. The villains look fine though, but those Toa are... It's important to note that the Toa Nuva now look this way thanks to adaptive armor they received in Carta Nui. I prefer the idea of Toa being transformed via mutation, but whatever, it's fine I guess. I also find it kind of odd that they would go right back to selling the Toa Nuva after those following the story just saw them get their asses kicked by the Paraka.
I don't want to play with you anymore.
Carta Nui followed the Toa on another fetch quest, this time to find the missing keystones that, when put together, will open the Kodrex, which will allow them to awaken the sleeping spirit of Matanui. And yes, Matanui isn't just an island, it's the name of basically Bionicle God as well. I probably should have mentioned that. The Matoran were also team players this time around, as the Fantoka wave featured Matoran that would clip onto the Toa's back, a fun idea and one of the few things that I really liked about this arc. This time the comics were illustrated by Lee Gallagher. The art isn't bad, but I can't help but feel it's a huge step down from Sager's work. Being only 4 issues, there's plenty of significant details that are quickly glanced over. For one, the villains of this arc are all referred to as Makuta, which was pretty confusing at first, but I eventually got the idea that it was more of a class thing and that Makuta Pterodax was still top dog. Takanuva also makes a return, this time with a design that, while badass, doesn't seem fitting for the Toa of Light. Supposedly his appearance has changed after traveling through alternate dimensions or something, but the comics do not go into that at all, probably leaving a lot of readers confused, including me. The thing they did with the Mask of Life itself in this arc was also bizarre. Here the Kanoi Ignika just decides to build itself a body to help the Toa fight for Matanui's sake. This only gets more confusing when you discover later that Matanui's spirit was actually hidden away in the Mask of Life the whole time. But this isn't Matanui, so the mask and the spirit are like 2 separate entities, I guess. Yeah, Battle for Power may be a decent story outside of the comics, but here there's just way too much going on and too little time to tell the story. I think it's safe to call it my least favorite Bionicle arc, at least when it comes to the comics. Anyway, so the Toa managed to resurrect Matanui, who turned out to be a giant robot hidden beneath the sea. But surprise, Makuta Pterodax has managed to slip into his body, and now he has finally conquered the world. He takes the Mask of Life with Matanui's spirit hidden inside and yeets it to the planet of Bara Magna, thus beginning the final arc of the Bionicle Saga. Here we are, folks. The big finale. Bionicle Glatorian. To my knowledge, a lot of Bionicle fans aren't really fond of this arc, and I think a lot of people were just losing interest around this time, but I actually really like Glatorian. Well, most of it, but I'll get to that later. Glatorian takes place on Bara Magna, a desert planet where gladiators settled disputes by battles in arenas. The main villains of this series were the Skrull, led by leader-class Skrull, Tuma.
It's not a tumor. It's not a tumor.
The mythology of the Glatorian arc is a fresh start for Bionicle, and it's neat to see both the many similarities and differences between the residents of Bara Magna and Aqua Magna. The art this time was done by Popmon, and I really like how it looks, especially with the colors provided by Ulysses Areola. Glatorian is still a shorter arc made up of only 7 comics total, but it does a good job at setting up the world, as it's fairly easy to follow when compared to most Bionicle lore. Eventually, the previous Bionicle lore combines with the new, as the Mask of Life lands in the deserts of Bara Magna, forming a new body, this time inhabited by the great spirit of Matanui, who must go on a quest to get back to his home planet of Aqua Magna and defeat Makuta. The idea of having what is basically Bionicle God be the main protagonist for the final few issues was a smart choice. Unfortunately, the comics eventually lead into another cliffhanger that relies on you to watch one of their shitty movies to know what happens next. However, I much prefer how it's handled here, where the movie simply acts as a part of the arc rather than the definitive ending, as issues 5, 6, and 7 of Glatorian are the actual conclusion. Which brings me to the one thing that I dislike about this arc: the ending. During this period of time, Bionicle was on its way out as toy sales were declining, so LEGO released a new set called Bionicle Stars. A lot of people hate these sets, as their designs are closer to Matoran than Toa, but I think it's a fun idea. What better way to close out the series than with a collection of previous heroes and villains coming together in chibi versions of themselves. Unfortunately, the way in which these toys are implemented into the story is a complete mess. Characters just show up with either unexplained or lazy changes. We know that the Mask of Life changes Tahu into a former version of himself for some reason, but as to why Takanuva and Gresh look the way they do, I don't know. The Skrull's change in design is especially confusing, as they went from being tall and menacing to short and somewhat menacing. The final 2 issues in which the stars lineup are introduced is both confusing and rushed. There's very little reason for them to even be there, as the main battle occurring at the time is actually the one between Makuta and Matanui, who has now transferred his spirit into a new giant robot body. Even the way in which Makuta is defeated feels uninspired and rushed, as he accidentally hurdles a moon at himself that conveniently smashes his head open. You can tell that a lot of faith in the Bionicle brand was dwindling around this time. Even the final chapter book was just dumped on the Bionicle website as opposed to being released in stores. It truly was a tragedy. But I would be lying if I didn't say that there was just something slightly satisfying about seeing a story that I had become invested in at such a young age come to an end. I got into Bionicle around the age of 4 or 5, and I had stuck with it until the age of 12 or 13. Even as I grew up, my interest in it was slightly dwindling towards the end, and the expanse of nearly 10 years, for me at least, was the perfect amount of time for me to stick with it till the very end. The series would eventually make a short-lived comeback as a reboot in 2015, but I had little interest in it, and from what I've heard, I wasn't missing much.
But evil has taken the mask to unleash an army of skull spiders.
Bionicle, both the toy lines and the comics, was something that had a tremendous effect on the person I grew to be. Even if I didn't realize it, my love of those things is what led me to a lot of my current hobbies, like reading comics or collecting toys. Nowadays, even the mention of Bionicle is kind of treated like an obscure joke, and while I'm completely down with that, the series has always meant a lot more to me. Even when the comics weren't at their best, there's just something about the deep lore and watching the engaging story unfold that made it feel like much more than just another company trying to sell toys. It wasn't until going back and rereading these comics and exploring deeper into the lore that I discovered that I loved Bionicle then, and I still do today. And I think that I probably always will. So thank you to everyone who watched this video. This was an amazing trip down memory lane, and I love that I could share it with you. I hope to be back again soon with another video, and I hope I will see you all there. Goodbye.